Hello and welcome to another episode of our show. We have with us Graeme Fry and Jeremy. Jeremy. What's your last
Jeremy
name
Allen.
again? Jeremy.
Jeremy Allen.
That's a very British. That's an author's name right there. And did I say that right? Graeme Fry.
Yeah, Graeme Fry.
Okay. All right. So, hello and welcome to another episode of our show. We're joined with Graeme Fry and Jeremy Allen of the podcast Oxford Lives. And it's a very interesting show in that they speak to people that are from Oxford and their eccentric lives. One of the guests they had on was Bernie Sanders' brother, which I never got around to listening to that one yet, but I heard the one that you two guys had, and it really kind of gave me a sense of what Oxford is. Can you tell us a little bit about Oxford, the community there?
Yeah, I mean, certainly Oxford's a town 40 miles west of London in the south of England. But of course, it's mostly famous for the university. The university sort of dominates the centre of the town because it's in lots and lots of old buildings because they're basically medieval and from the Middle Ages. And so if you look at Oxford online, that's what you'll see, the sort of old stone buildings dating back to God knows when. But we had a guest on our show, a guy called Richard O. Smith, who's a local writer, and he maintains that there are three sides to Oxford. There's the university, which people talk about Gown, that's the Gown part of Oxford. Then there's town, which is people like Jeremy and I who live here, living here and do everything. And then the third part is the visitors, because of course it gets millions of visitors every year. So it's a quintessentially, in some ways, college town, but it's also, it's got a whole life of its own. I mean, there's a car plant here, for instance. You know the mini cars, you see the minis, the BMW minis, they're all built in Oxford. So we've got a car plant on the edge of town, and we've also got a whole range of different people who live here doing all sorts of things, from research to whatever. And then there's people like Jeremy and I who've moved here from different parts of the UK. And there are people, I mean, I always think if you walk into the centre of Oxford, if you haven't heard 5 or 6 different languages by the time you get to town in 10 minutes, it's not been a great day. You know, there are so many people in the world here. And I'm sure there are lots and lots of Canadians here as well. So, so that's a brief town of about 200,000 people, are we, Jeremy and Pete?
I think it's slightly low. It's so weird, and I was going to say it's a very transient population, so the population is very hard to measure. I think it's about 160,000, but it's difficult to gauge because people just come here. I mean, a lot of people do work at the university or on something affiliated. They come over and do an MA or a PhD or a research thesis, or they come over to lecture a couple of months. And it's not just Oxford University. For a start, there's another university here called Brookes. So add another 28,000 students to the Oxford package, everything that entails. But there's also loads of business colleges, language schools, sixth form colleges, and just regular school. I mean, there's so much education here, sort of capitalising on the Oxford name and cachet. But it's got a very transient population. And one of the problems we've had is actually most of our guests have been people who've moved to Oxford rather than they've grown up here. And we've tried to set the record straight on that with our last guest, didn't we? I think with Chris Heap. We thought we want somebody who's lived here all their life. But even he moved here when he was 5 from Ireland. So it's just difficult because there is a native population here. But I think what it is with the transient people, I make them sound like gypsies, but with the transient people, they've tended to move here for professional reasons. Right. So they're usually quite, upwardly mobile people, very keen to sell themselves. And so they're not shy in coming forward. Another problem we've had is getting the people we want, because people, I just assume everybody wants to talk about themselves, but that's not the case. A lot of people are quite reserved. But when I put a call out, because part of my background is from the theatre world, and those people don't have any sort of compunction about thrusting themselves in the limelight and selling their wares. I'll do it. Actually, no, we've had a couple of actors. We want somebody else. We want a scientist, or we want a dustman, or just a regular person.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a few leads we've been pursuing, which is quite sort of typical Oxford. Like I've been trying to get there's a game here called Aunt Sally, which is like a form of Skittles, and I had heard of it, but apparently it's only ever been played in Oxfordshire and a couple of other places. It's a sport that's confined to Oxfordshire. It's largely played in the back of pubs. So I've been trying to get the local Aunt Sally. It sounds really weird. The local Aunt Sally Society to appear, but again, they're just a little bit wary and shy. And the same with people from the local history groups. It's a bit of a challenge to get people who aren't, from outside and who specialize in other things. We kind of want more locals, don't we? Because part of the reason we set up the podcast was to connect the community and let the one side of the community talk to the other. Anyway, I've kind of gone off.
Well, that's totally fine. I mean, as you're speaking, I was thinking about, like, is Oxford, so in places in the country, there's development, sort of research development areas, like in California, it's Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. So is Oxford kind of like this specific sort of place where, people go there, they don't necessarily raise their families, but they work on their education and then they go elsewhere, or is there a resurgence in sort of?
They might stay here for the rest of their lives, but they're not from here. They don't come from the culture. So I guess it's a bit like London in that respect. There's a sort of what you might call a metropolitan elite, or not necessarily a metropolitan elite, but I mean, like you're saying, Silicon Valley, there's a science complex here that's away from the university. So a lot of scientific research gets done here, but also the university itself, because the vaccine one of the vaccines was developed here. Wow. But the town and gown divide is huge. I mean, I guess it's the same in every university town, but here it's massive. I worked for Oxford University Press. The department I worked in was customer services, so I guess there were people there because for a start, it wasn't representative of the city in any way. I wouldn't have thought so. When I got on the I'll be frank, when I got on the bus in the morning, I guess 1 in 3 people on that bus was black. When I got to the main building in town where I worked, the only black people seemed to work on the security gate. So for that, it was just constant. That it just felt weird. But in my office, it was a little bit different because it was accounts. So it wasn't really part of it. It was accounts and customer service. So it wasn't really part of the academic world. So you got a few more local people. So it was like a microcosm within a microcosm, or a bubble within a bubble. And there were people in that office who had the local accent and lived there all their lives. They'd never visited a college, which is the main tourist attraction. There's 39 colleges now, Graham?
Yeah, 39.
They've just added one. So there's 39 colleges. These beautiful buildings, hundreds and hundreds of years of history. They've never, and there's people around where I live who've never visited a college, and it is like two separate worlds. Tourists who come here will get one view of Oxford because they'll be in a little guest house near the city centre, and they'll be doing the museums and visiting the colleges and doing the bus ride. And they won't see the council estates on the outskirts of the town because that's all been shifted outwards to the periphery. So you've got a town that has the top 20% income bracket and the lowest 20% income bracket, and not a lot in between. So that's
an interesting point, because it is in some ways it's a slightly strange place because of its history and because of the academic institutions here, but it's a lovely place to live. I mean, this is the point. I mean, Jeremy, you can be critical of your own place, but
I'm not. I love it here.
And I mean, we both are. That's partly why we set up the podcast, to get other people's views on. Because Jeremy and I would sit there and say to each other, occasionally have a moan about sitting in the pub with a beer and have a moan about because you can do that in your own town, in your own town. But then we thought, well, neither of us are actually from here, and we've had different histories, and then most of the people we know sort of drifted into Oxford for some reason or other, and we were trying to get a bit more under the skin of the city and find out the way it ticks. I'm not sure if we've done that because everybody we've interviewed has been so different from it.
funny how that is. Your goal is to try and understand the pulse, get your finger on the pulse of this community, this culture, and then it ends up opening all these other doors.
I mean, there are many cultures here. There's a very large West Indian population here who arrived in the 50s to work in the car factories. And the car factory was huge. At the BMW factory, which used to be the Mini factory. I mean, the Mini was developed here. But before that, it was Morris Motors, which was one of the biggest car manufacturers in the world, and that employed a huge proportion of the town's population. I mean, it's different now. There's still a fair few thousand people who work there, but it's not, because it's all automated and mechanized and computerized, and there tends to be, if you go there, because I've done a tour of the plant, most people who work there are temp or temporary workers. And those people come from all over the world. So that the base of that, the core of that has vanished over the decades.
So like any kind of town, it sounds like, okay, so in Vancouver, Graham was talking about how he was on the train and he was going across to the border, the US border. And I'm like, I have never been on that train. So you could live in a town and these things that it's like, as a tourist, you got to do this, you got to do that. That when you live there, you're like, oh yeah, I'll get around to that, but then you never experience it.
No, it's true. It's absolutely true.
So if you were a tourist, and again, there's this huge tourist population, which we'll talk about in terms of COVID, but what are like usually the top 3 things that somebody has to do when they visit Oxford?
Well, here I've got to defer to Jeremy because one of his professions he's a tour guide.
Yes. And he was talking about, I'm like, a tour guide during COVID, like, damn, that's going to come up. That's going to come up.
Well, I had about 4 months work last year because, I work for a company called City Sightseeing, and we do bus tours, but we also do walking tours. I tend to do more walking tours these days, but for most of last year, the bus tours didn't run. I've just had the word we're starting back on April the 1st doing walking tours, but we're not putting guides on the buses yet because you just can't get the social distancing, until it's a bit safer anyway. But what I would recommend, and this isn't just because it's my living, but whenever I go to a foreign city, I do a round robin tour, usually on a bus, to get an overview and to get the lie of the land, and get a general sense of it. And those tickets are usually good for about 24 to 48 hours, and you can then use it as a taxi service. Oxford isn't a very big place. I mean, you can walk from any one place to another within 10 minutes, from A to B, wherever, really, in regards to the centre and everything you want to see. It's all quite accessible. But yeah, get your bearings. So I do a bus tour, then I do a walking tour, and you can usually get a ticket that covers both. In fact, I know you can, because I deal with those people. And then I go and see a couple of the colleges, maybe 2 or 3 colleges. Christchurch or Morden, one of the bigger colleges.
Jeremy, is it worth just saying to Rob that the structure of the University of Oxford is very different because it's not one monolithic. It's made of 39 colleges which are independent or quasi-independent. So they're all completely different. They have their own admissions policy. They have their own,
So Oxford, and sorry to interrupt, because this is what I was trying to figure out. It's like a pan coalition of universities. Is that right? Because when you see Oxford University Press, because I went to university and I gave you guys a lot of money, but is that just in reference to like all these kind of universities?
No, well, the technical name is the University of Oxford, and it's comprised of 39 individual colleges. Okay. They call it the collegiate system. Cambridge is the same. I think Harvard and Yale might be the same, because I've had American tourists say it's a very similar feel. But yeah, it is very confusing. It's very confusing because I've got tourists, and I take it for granted. I had tourists halfway through the tour say, "Okay, when are we actually going to see the university?" I said, "Well, you've been looking at it for the last." It's here. It's like, so you go into the whole of the city centre is the university, but it's mixed up with other stuff, with shops and banks and restaurants. So you might have a delicatessen, and then you have a college, and then you have a bank, and then you have another college, then you have a library, whatever. and each college is usually hundreds of years old, and like Graham says, has its own history, has its own traditions, has its own admission policy, and is pretty much autonomous. There is an administrative body which supervises the whole, but it's very loose. They're pretty independent of each other, and for the most part, the student will do all of his lessons within that one college. There's just maybe if it's the odd one or two specialised subject, they'll go to a lecture somewhere else, but it's mostly confined to the college. If most of them have halls of residence where, at least for the first year, you'll be lodging within that college. You might need to find some accommodation elsewhere after that, but it won't be in another college. It'll be first year on campus, second year in a shared house somewhere, or private accommodation.
Because it's really interesting, the history, and sorry, I didn't get around to that original question of the top 3 places, but we'll return there. The history of universities where I live, and Graham might know this, is it's very young, right? In terms of Western history, obviously there were indigenous people living here before us, and they were here a lot longer than us. But as for settlers from England, all over the world, we've been here about 150 years. So the universities here are very young, right? And a lot of them, they don't really have that sort of, there's something about history and culture that just kind of go hand in hand. You get that sort of, because we've been the rugby team here for 100 years, right? There's that sort of connection to the past. Whereas when I went to university, I was like, I didn't really understand that, right? There wasn't that prestige, I guess. So for somebody who goes to Oxford, is that like a, that's my jersey, kind of, this is my identity. That's something that to be proud of.
I mean, the other thing you sort of need to understand about the sort of Oxford and you, as one of, it's one of the best known universities in the world. Yeah. So they kind of, one of the things I do is I coach some of the students as they're coming towards the end to talk about where they're going to go. I know they all want to go into banking and consultancy.
Right. Yeah.
Not all, sorry, but that's my background, sort of particularly management consulting. So I sort of sit down with them and say, right, help them develop their CVs, introduce them to people, that sort of thing. But it's quite interesting. I was talking to one of my students, and she comes from very working class background. And we'd have sessions together. And in fact, she had to, she couldn't come to one session because she had to go back home because her brother had been arrested and she had to get him out of jail.
Oh, yeah.
So you tend to think of Oxford as these, as a very sort of very high echelon people coming from rich backgrounds. Right. And there is a big part of that. Yeah. But lots of other people come here as well. And the university, does, I think, a pretty good job of attracting people from blue collar background, etc. But once you've been here, there's a certain, and you can tell, I mentioned this girl particularly because she was sort of has a snobbery about the university out of proportion to her background, if you know what I mean. She comes from a very modest family, but the fact she was here, she walks around with a spring in her step. Maybe people feel the same. I didn't go here. I didn't go to this university. I went to the University of Liverpool. But the people who've been here, it does seem to, just the Oxford name, give them a bit of a boost in life, to where they might end up. I don't know what your view on this is, Jeremy. Is that?
Well, I think they are getting better at it because it's been traditionally about 50% private education, 50% state education.
Oh.
I don't know what your system is in Canada, but privately educated, which confusingly is often called public school. Like if you've been to a public school, it means you had a private education and your parents have paid a lot of money in order to do that, to give you an advantage. And that's 7% of the population, but up until fairly recently, because they've tried to tweak that now, but up until recently, it was roughly 50% Oxbridge students who had a private education. I think if you do come from a more working class background, you can struggle to fit in socially, not just economically, but I have known of people who've had, struggled to fit in with the habits and the mores and the, I guess the way people carry themselves, and their assumptions. I did hear another story, and this was from one of our guests, Simon Image, who said he's got a friend who went for an interview, a working class guy from Liverpool, went for an interview at Balliol College. And they basically said, well, most of the students here are from pretty public school backgrounds. We don't really think you fit in. Why don't you try this college down the road? They were quite frank. Maybe they're doing him a favour, but I found it quite shocking, really. But in terms of the atmosphere, in terms of growing up here, I mean, it's quite... I went to what they call a red brick university, which is quite a modern university, de Montfort in Leicester. But here it is like another world. It is quite rarefied. And I mean, it is actually aesthetically beautiful as well. Most of the colleges follow a similar sort of architectural design. There's a quad in the middle with grass square. And it is, I don't know if you've seen the movie Chariots of Fire where they run around the quad.
I'm very familiar with the theme song.
Right. Well, it's a bit like that. I mean, it is. You could be in the 1920s or even the 1800s, and it's, even though it's the city centre, if you go into one of these colleges, it's very, very tranquil. It's very well maintained. It's beautiful to look at. There's not actually that many students comparatively, so you are part of this rarefied world. And I think if you talk about the people who are in government now, many of them came from Eton or another top public school straight to Oxford. And the look of Eton is very similar to Oxford, or the look of Harrow or any of these top public schools. It's this sort of limestone or sandstone, beautifully kept building, beautiful grounds. And it's very, I don't want to use the word twee, but it is quite archaic and oldie worldly and privileged. And so if you've grown up going to one of these schools, you then, because of your advantageous primary education, got a place at Oxford or Cambridge, and you've gone straight into government, into the Houses of Parliament, because basically no one do a job anymore. They go straight into being a career politician. You haven't really engaged with the wider world. And I think that maybe that's the problem. You may have the best education in the world, but you don't know what normal people have to go through or average people have to go through.
That is an excellent point, man. I mean, like, I was very fortunate in where I live. When I was growing up in my class, you know, not everybody looked like me. If you get what I'm saying, like there was walks of all life. And I think having that experience at a young age is, you know, so totally advantageous, because then you start to see, okay, you know, there's different cultures than my own, and I can actually get a lot out of that. But when you have this sort of, and I can't speak to Oxford because obviously I've never been there and I have no idea, but when you have an elitist culture and it keeps recycling the same people through, you're not really going to get any changes. Like, have you ever read that book, Guns, Germs, and Steel?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Excellent.
About what has actually made the big changes in history, you know, what they've been. Yeah, exactly.
And some of the big changes are when we actually like have people of different perspectives all sharing. But when we're all just like, ancient China, it was very closed off. So influences couldn't get in there. So they actually remained quite stagnant while the Western world was, you know, colonizing the known world, you know, in parenthesis. And then it had this explosion in culture. But when you have this sort of stagnant, same faces, same kind of backgrounds, is you actually don't get as much innovation. But then when you start including people from working class backgrounds that you're mentioning, you get this kind of it's like a diversification effect. Anyways, you're able to think different and problem solve different.
Well, this is what happened in the Second World War when the Americans came into the war. But I won't say Americans because I know you Canadians have a bit of an issue. When the US came into the war, I mean, you were part of our army, Canada,
That's
Commonwealth.
Right.
But anyway, certainly in regards of Britain, they noticed this stagnation because what happened in the US, they took a load of, because they had this huge sort of, very quickly developed a huge military industrial might.
They were arms dealers.
They were arms dealers.
US with arms dealers, yeah.
But they fast-tracked these people into senior officers' positions. So they could come from any background, but because they had that sort of innovative mind, they didn't have that restrictive class structure. And what they noticed here was there was a sort of tiered structure in the army, and there was a mutual kind of distant, or there was a distance, and there was a grudging thing, and a, you know, more than my job's worth attitude, and a hangover from the class struggles of the 1930s that was kind of alien to the US soldiers coming over to northern France. It was like you get an infantryman and a US tank would come along and say, could you clear the road? Could you clear those obstacles out of the way so I can drive this tank? I say, well, that's not my job. And I was shocked at this attitude. And there was a lot of, you know, but basically the talent wasn't advanced because they were stuck in this very rigid sort of archaic class structure, I guess.
Well, even think how World War I was fought. Like they were sending cavalry charges against machine guns. It's like, what in the hell are you thinking, right? And that's why, again, you know, like I can go off on random tangents, of course, but we do have to adapt. We can be so stuck in the way that we do things that we don't adapt, and we suffer as a consequence. While other people,
no, precisely so. And I think this is a symptom of, or you could see the same effect with any of the elite education establishments anywhere in the world. I'm sure people would say the same about Harvard or Yale or the Grande École in Paris, and you know, who've got these deep roots in history, and they produce a certain sort of person at the end, no matter where they came from. And as like Jeremy said, particularly the UK, and you've got to say suffered at one level, but there has been the political elite has tended to go through the same system. And the same thing happened in France. They go through, I lived for several years in the US as well, you know, 6-7 years, I think it was, during the 80s and early 90s. And anyone who thinks the US doesn't have a class system it's
a caste system.
Yeah, exactly. So you know, the point is, I think if you were to go, I think you get the same sort of people churned out at Oxford and Cambridge as you get from Harvard, you get from Yale, you get from the Grande École in Paris, where all the French presidents of the top French have all been through the same schools. You know, and I think it's general speaking, it's not great. You know what I mean? We do need a diversification, and we do need to find a way of getting people involved. And it does happen here because, you know, we do get people going to politics and from all sorts of ethnic backgrounds and whatever. Yeah. But if you look back, David Cameron, Boris Johnson, they're all from exactly the same. They all went to Eton, then they went to Oxford, and then they went straight into being a researcher for a government member, and then eventually got elected themselves. So that you know, and the fact is, they're all a member of a thing called the Bullingdon Club, which is a road not far from here where I'm sitting now, where they all used to share a house when they were undergraduates, and they had this terrible reputation for partying and trash restaurants, but there were elite people who had the money to do this. They were the working class kids who came through Oxford. These were very much the upper echelons, and then went on. So I'm very much with what Jeremy said about about there is a structure here, but it's not. I don't think my experience is it's not really uniquely, you know, a United Kingdom thing. It comes from, and I'm sure it happens in Canada as well.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah. I mean, like, you know. I knew a teacher, and she was supporting South Africa during the apartheid eras. And the South African teacher said to her, she's like, well, this is all great that you're helping us with this, but what about your apartheid? And the teacher was like, well, what do you mean? Well, in Canada, we had what are called residential schools. And that's where we put in Indigenous children against their will, took them from their families, like a police officer came and took them from their families and forced them into boarding schools. So my point is that, you know, I can wag my finger at anybody, but we all have our history, right? Yeah. But the point is that, you know, yes, we have that history, but now we really do have to work together if we want to survive, you know, because we're both looking over at the same country, and that's China. You know what I'm saying? Like we have got to come together here, people. So one thing that you were speaking about too that I thought was really interesting was Brexit and during COVID, and Oxford is kind of a unique place because it does have that tourism and the university, but Brexit happens, and now you're sort of thinking like, okay, is this a good idea? Or, what are your guys' thoughts on that?
Well, I think both Jeremy and I are very much on the same page here. We thought it was a disaster. And sorry, Jeremy, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I know we've talked about this an awful lot. And it was just, it was a populist, if you like, revolt against the government. Just the things we've been talking about, people who are out of touch with, by people. By people who mostly came back from a white working class, underprivileged backgrounds, who then all suddenly got up and voted to leave the EU, which everybody had told them was a disaster for them, essentially. And of course, but went ahead. Having been, I was in the States in January last year doing on a political sort of thing from here, and we went to Iowa to look at the primaries in Iowa. When they were choosing the candidates for this was just before lockdown, and the same people who voted for Trump. And we went to a Trump rally at one point. Now, I know these people. They come from the north of England, where I come from. They're exactly with the same motivations, and I'm sure that they are all over the world. You could go to some poor part of BC, I'm sure, and find people who would be of the same view. And that it shows how badly the elites in this. But yeah, Jeremy, what's your view on this? Oh, sorry, you got.
Sorry, well, I was going to say, with regards to Oxford, well, first of all, in terms of how the country voted for Brexit, it was predominantly for leave. So if you look at a map, even though it was 50-50 roughly, I think it was
in Oxford, it was 50-50.
Oh no, in the country.
In the country,
yes.
It was 52% voted for leave, 48% voted to remain. So it was roughly 50-50. It wasn't a huge majority. So it split the country down the middle. But geographically, if you were to look at a map, a bit like when you see the US maps, and it always seems like on election night, it always seems like, and I know they flip it, don't they? So red means Republican on that map, and it's usually mostly red. You think, well, how come the Democrat? It's because of population centers like California, whatever, 35 million people, and most of them vote Democrat. New York and the East Coast. Well, it was similar. The map of Brexit was similar. So it's basically London. London was the only place that voted for Remain. Apart from one or two, Liverpool voted Remain, but then they're slightly different. There's a lot of Irish people, a lot of Irish heritage. And of course, it would break the connection with Ireland, as it is threatening to do now. Right. So, but Liverpool's always been a bit of a rebel city anyway. And apart from that, it was really university cities like Newcastle and Oxford. So Oxford is a bubble. Oxford's a bit like London. It's very liberal. It's very cosmopolitan in terms of its ethnic makeup, geographical, nationalities that are here, and it's very academic. So Oxford was very predominantly Remain, but within that, because I work for City Sightseeing, most of the bus drivers voted for leave and were quite fervent about it. I heard that on the morning of when the result came through, they were down the depot, all the drivers and the mechanics, listening to the radio. And when it came through that leave had won, they all cheered. I also heard that just after the cheer, and I'm not going to repeat one of the drivers said something very racist. I'm not going to say what it is because it's horrible. And my boss, who's fairly level-headed, said, "Look, I put up with a lot. I'm not going to put up with that." So just to point out, and the drivers, the majority of these drivers and they're all nice guys, by the way. I get on with all of them, but the majority of them are Oxford born and bred. So they all have that slight, or most of them have a slight West Country twang, Oxfordshire accent. So they're the minority, but that shows me, even though Oxford voted for Remain, within that, the working class enclave still voted predominantly for Leave. So it's very much a class-based thing, and you could say it's a class-based rebellion, which I'd be all in favour of, except I think it's been manipulated, and it's been manipulated by people from very well-heeled backgrounds like Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, and it's been manipulated through the right-wing tabloid media and various other media outlets, but on a false premise, really, that the EU is this dictatorial force, and that we're obliged to comply with all its rules, and all our rules and laws are made within Brussels or Strasbourg, and then but you put people on the line, and usually, what laws are you sick and tired of obeying that weren't contrived in this country? And they usually fall down at that point. Their arguments become quite spurious. It was like, oh, bendy bananas or something, that whole thing. And a lot of these myths were actually generated by Boris Johnson when he was a foreign newspaper correspondent. And it just for the sheer hell of it, just to make headlines, he just make up things like, the EU have dictated that every banana must be straight, or something ridiculous, or they're gonna
sensationalist.
They're gonna scrap cheese and onion crisps, or something stupid.
He sounds like Citizen Kane. You ever seen that movie?
Yeah.
Right, and it's just like, dude.
Yeah, it was. But we're living with the consequence now. But I think it's going to be fascinating to see what happens post-COVID, and because all at once, of course, in the UK was we finally left the EU at the end of last year, at the end of 2020, and then of course we're right in the middle of the whole COVID thing. So it was, it's going to be very, very interesting to see what happens after politically, well, all over the world, I suppose, but just for us here in the UK. The tidal wave, we've got hit by 2 tidal waves coming in seemingly opposite directions. So it will be interesting. Yeah.
Well, yeah. If ever there was divine intervention, I think COVID. You know what I mean? Although it was a guy who ate a bat, but anyways. The other thing too is that we're seeing this sort of like this national sort of reliance on oneself, and we're kidding ourselves if again that's not being seen around the world. It's not just a UK thing. I mean, also think about Trump in America, right? And there's undercurrents of that here in Canada, of this sort of like nationalist kind of fervor, right? These anti-maskers have now been amalgamated to like the government's trying to take our rights, and it's like, dude, like, come on, like, let's think about this, right? That doesn't make any sense. But anyways, when you get people sharing crazy ideas, these things, and there's a book that I read, it's called Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race.
Oh, yeah.
I read that book.
And it's based in the UK. And I thought there was some really good points because, again, we think it's immigration that we need to be afraid of. But actually, I really do think it's these like, the Ted Cruzes of the world, right? Texas is, this world's worst snowstorm, and he's flown off to Cancun, right? So it's like, who's actually looking out for the best interests of people versus who's looking out for their agenda? And really, again, in the United States, Stacey Abrams, who was this sort of activist, got people to vote in Georgia. And she single-handedly saved democracy from a second term of Donald Trump. And if that would have happened, that would have been disastrous. Yeah. Right?
I think we were all quite baffled at the Trump phenomenon over here. And then we had Brexit. And now with Boris Johnson, it's like, well, we're kind of on a plateau, really. I mean, we haven't had sort of mobs of rednecks storming Parliament, but we're kind of, and I don't think it's any coincidence that all these populist regimes have dealt terribly with COVID. There seems to be a common denominator there, like with the States and with Britain, India, Brazil. It seems to be these populist regimes presiding over countries that have dealt with COVID pretty terribly.
I think it's because they're not practical, right?
No.
Like populism by itself, definitively is not practical. You're trying to give everybody what they want. That's not how the world works.
No,
you do have to make some hard decisions. Yeah, you have to make tough decisions. Now, the other one I wanted to talk to you guys about is you're mentioning culture, and COVID happens, and now you talked about how I believe Graham was saying that he was a producer, and the big blockbuster films, we're not going to really be seeing that anymore. Now it's more kind of these smaller production sort of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I know Graham probably, but I've actually, one of the benefits of lockdown for me, I've just watched so many movies, and I've made that time because I've been on furlough.
Right.
And I've just been trying to educate me. One thing, I was always very critical of Netflix, for instance, and their selection of movies. You didn't get many classics, and you didn't get many blockbusters either. But what I've started to notice over here, a lot of British independent films are now going on pretty quickly onto Netflix. I mean, loads of them. We had the Independent Film Awards last week, and half those films are now on Netflix, and they're only 2020 films. Some of them go straight onto net, so they're getting a much bigger audience than they used to. So I'm thinking maybe that's one thing that's going to benefit certainly our film industry.
Right.
They're just going to get more distribution.
It is interesting, but it comes down to, I mean, I come from it from a producer point of view, so I'm intimately involved in thinking about the finances of these things. So, and that's part of the problem, that if you've only got one route to market, say via Netflix, then when they pay, how they pay, if they pay, is really down to them. And so the budgets can be constrained. And also the other thing is that they say, well, it used to be that if a producer wanted to go with, or a commissioner wanted to go with a film, they'd say, yeah, okay, and we'll give you some money up front to help cash flow, especially the early stages, development stages. That seems not to be happening now. And so that they'll say, yeah, we'll take it onto the platform, not necessarily Netflix or whatever, but we'll take it on. But they might not see any money for 2 years. Right. So that all has to be cash flowed all the way through. It's a lot of money to raise to do it. And in fact, I'm involved with a project now where we're setting up a platform to put creatives directly in touch with the commissioners and the producers with in a standardized way of pitching, because it's very ad hoc at the moment, believe it or not, for such a big industry. But we put together a whole, and in fact, I've just been involved in raising the first round of finance for it. It's called Smash. And basically it's been set up by 2 women producers who were saying, look, this is the weakness in the industry. How do you think a person who's sitting in her back bedroom in somewhere in a province somewhere with a fantastic idea, but has got no way of getting in front of the right people who are looking for an idea? And so they put together a whole, and like I say, raised the first round of finance for it. So I think it's things like that, innovative approaches like that I think saving grace culturally, especially for film and TV, rather than the system we've got at the moment, or depending on Netflix or someone to take it on, because you're always playing very low down, and it's hard to get the money back. It's hard to pay the actors. It's hard to pay so as ever, the dirty money comes into this cultural side, well, especially in film, which is like Jeremy. One of my big loves is film, but you have to understand that that's an expensive business to make low budget productions. It's still very, you still have to sink a lot of money into it and get a lot of people involved. So yeah.
Well, and something that I was sort of thinking about is I have no knowledge of production of film and the money that goes into it, but I imagine that these big blockbuster films that they get carte blanche, whatever you guys want, but there's a very specific sort of epistemology with it, right? Like, so for example, the most recent Star Wars film, some of the messaging in it seems so force-fed because they had so much money, but the executives were like, okay, well, we got to make sure that we have, inclusivity. We got to make sure that we have, like the color spectrum, all this stuff. And it's like, okay, I'm seeing that this is a little bit force-fed. Like, I guess what I'm saying is that when you have smaller productions, you get people that are saying what they want to say versus what the executives want them to say, if that makes sense.
I mean, I'd make the point that that's actually a different industry. The whole blockbuster is what they call the tentpole productions in the the one thing that holds everything else up. That's a different industry, or almost a different industry. They're films, but the business they're in is Saturday night entertainment. So
right.
they're competing with restaurants, they're competing with bowling alleys, they're competing with concert. That's the industry. It's to get people out on a independent film is a completely different thing. You know, and most people will never make the transition who work in the industry from the independent and small production into the blockbuster level. You know, it's just a different business. It's like someone said to the guy who runs Rolex, said to him, you know, what's the watch industry like? He said, got an idea. I'm in the luxury goods business. You know,
yeah,
it's a different thing.
Completely different beast.
Yeah. So if you're a young director, writer, actor, what you're looking at is something very, very different from what we see. You know, it's just not the same business.
And
I was going to say I've noticed similar trends with the BBC, who are our national broadcaster, a bit like what you were talking about with the Star Wars scenario, that kind of social engineering.
Great word for it.
To be honest, I don't really have that much of a problem with Star Wars because it's a fantasy universe.
Yes.
But most BBC drama, it's a bit like a quota system. I think the US drama was the same in the 70s, like when 1 in 4 actors has to be black. I think that the problem with me watching it is it doesn't always ring true. It's like, well, the top magistrate in the land is a black person. I think, well, how likely? I know it could happen, but it seems to be like a lot of people black. I don't want to sound racist, but it's an authenticity. And I get the feeling they're trying to lead society rather than reflect society, you know. But that seems to be overturned now. There was a series called I May Destroy You, which seemed a lot more convincing in the way different genders and sexualities and races would integrate. That the circumstances of their lives seem much more convincing, if you see, than a top sort of British detective being a black guy.
I can't stand forced messaging. You know what I mean? Like, for example, there's a show on Netflix called Bridgertown, which, you know, for anybody who can just stop and reflect, Bridgetown. So there's a bridge between the white community and the black community, and we all just got to get.
I haven't
don't watch it. It's garbage. It's trite.
I have seen it.
Yeah.
In terms of as a soap opera, I didn't mind it, but I think I think the writer comes from California, and she said she'd done a bit of research, and she said there were black people around in London at that time, and there were, just like there always have been, but not in that quantity, and certainly not in the royal family there weren't. I mean, it's historical, and people say it's great because it's showing it's colorblind casting, I think they call it. It's giving historical period drama roles to people who didn't have access to those roles before. But I think it could set a dangerous precedent, because actually Britain at that time was in slavery, and it may be sending the wrong historical message that actually things were fine back then.
And that industry, because that's what it was horrific. And furthermore, the black actors are really, they're kind of they're placating to a white culture, right? Like this, hello, miss, how are you? Right? And it's like, there's assimilation going on there that I think is kind of a dangerous message, right? Because
do you know what?
Go ahead, Graeme.
Yeah, it's interesting. My daughter, I was talking to my daughter about this, and I made exactly the same point you've got about Bridget, and said, it's just completely ridiculous. You know, it's the way it's well written. And she looked at me pityingly and she said, Dad, you do realize that this is what she calls mummy porn. It's actually porn for women.
50 Shades of Grey.
Because clothes have been ripped off it.
All these studs, and you're like, I don't like, if I shaved my chest, I'd look like that.
Yeah, well, I don't think I ever would, but you know what I mean?
I think there is a counter argument. There is a counter argument, and in this country, I mean, there has been social engineering, particularly in our soap operas, our top soap operas. Coronation. This will probably mean nothing to you.
Oh, my grandmother loved Coronation Street.
Yeah, EastEnders, from the 80s, they started having gay characters.
Yeah.
And there's no doubt that in our society in Britain, we're a million times more tolerant and accepting of gay people. It's pretty much accepted. When I was growing up as a teenager in the 80s, there was still stigma around it. Then they started bringing in a lot of gay characters on television drama. And so it was social engineering. I remember watching at the time. I remember my sister laughing. There was a scene where the men were all having a late night card game in the back of the pub. And they thought that they were doing it secretly. They sort of got out of bed and they'd gone to the back of the Queen Vic and they were having a late night poker game. And all their wives came and caught them. And
but his wife didn't show up.
No, but what happened was one of the characters playing poker was gay, and his husband came along. And my sister going, "Oh, that wouldn't happen. This is the East End of London." But now I'm thinking, yeah, but maybe that was groundbreaking in a way. And I think maybe. I can't complain if it has changed society. It has led to. I can't complain. But for me personally, and what I enjoy about drama, I want authenticity, and I want some kind of truth.
Jeremy, I have to. I love that point because, I, not to sound pretentious, but I like to be as informed as I can about things on a real level, right? So reading, books and stuff, and that has helped me to sort of see things. To inform myself, because if I don't read, I'm just going to be like everybody else and sort of appealing to that social construction, social engineering. But when you sort of start to read these things, you can look at them and see, okay, I see what you're doing here, right? But for people that are a little bit more like, they're just living their lives. They're like, oh, they are like us, right? And it's like, well, yeah, no shit. But anyways, for some people, that's their sort of wake-up call to the masses.
Yeah, I think, and it's always, you're wary of patronizing people, but maybe some people need to be laid on thick. Yeah.
Yes.
Maybe they need to have it made that obvious.
Well, I have met people who salt of the earth, my aunt and uncle, they're wonderful people, but they're rednecks. And they watch things on TV, and that's their means of sort of people are different and that's okay. And they're like, oh, right. Like it's almost, they have to be spoon fed the principles of equality and equity. Right. Whereas for us, and here I am doing that us and them thing, but for myself, it's like, okay, with Bridgertown, I see what you're doing. And I'm not buying it, right?
But it's interesting with Bridgerton because I had an argument about this social engineering with a friend of mine, and she says, "How can you say that? How can you say there aren't black detectives?" And I said, "Well, there are, but it's just unlikely that black detective, Idris Elba, would be the best detective in London."
Yeah.
But I said, "Well, what shows you?" She says, "Well, I like color inclusive shows." I said, "What are you talking about?" She says, "Star Trek." I said, "Well, that's not an issue for me because that's a fantasy world, but in actual fact that's not meant to reflect real life. That's meant to be an ideal society in a way. But in actual fact, when I saw Bridgerton, I just assumed it was some kind of fantasy Disney world, a bit like Frozen or something. But then I noticed they're bringing real life historical characters like Queen Charlotte and King George. No, it is meant to be Regency England, but it's obviously absurd because
yeah. It's like my mother told me when I was like 5 that William Shakespeare died because someone threw a spear at his head. And I was like, and I was like, whoa, that must be true, right? And then I went to school and I found out that wasn't, like, I even put up my hand. He was killed by a spear. And the teacher looked at me like I was an idiot. So I guess what I'm saying is that, don't always trust what you hear. Like there are messages that are coming through, and these are good messages. I believe, there's good intention here, is what I'm trying to say. But sometimes the road to hell can be paved in good intentions, right? Yeah. And we do need to know the history of the things that we've done. Like I've mentioned, Indigenous people in Canada. If we made some rom-com docudrama about how wonderful it was between the Indigenous people and the settlers here, that would be wrong, and that would be kind of harmful.
Yeah.
Well, maybe the tone of Bridgerton makes it just about acceptable. I don't know, but it's set in 1815. We hadn't in Britain abolished slavery by then.
Right,
So that's my problem with it.
It's historically inaccurate.
It's historically inaccurate in the sense that there weren't that many black people in Britain or in London, and they certainly weren't members of the aristocracy.
Right.
I saw it pitched. Is it Shona? Shona, I've forgotten her name. Who's a producer, and she was pitching it as an alternative universe. You know,
right.
an alternative but better universe than Britain actually was in the 18th.
It's not made clear, is it? The premise isn't made clear.
You could see if you had never read a history book, you could pick it up and say, well, look, you know what? So there was no problem at all. You know, it was actually better then than it is now in terms of racial integration. You know, but I don't know. We're on difficult ground here, aren't we? I mean, it's you know.
Yeah, you're always wary about saying the wrong thing as well, and that's why I think a lot of people are self-censoring because of that very fact.
And to me, that's the problem. Is that when we're so afraid of getting it wrong that we don't do anything, that's when real difficulties can ensue. Like, that's why I have this show. It's, you know, I'm going to say something, and I try to be as inclusive as possible, you know, in terms of voices. And, you know, I'm going to say something, but please correct me, versus cancel culture, right? Because that is something that we have to be afraid of. When you cancel what people say, I think it actually makes people more extreme. I think that cancel culture has created this endotrophic effect of, it's created extremists, right? It's created these rednecks, and it's created this platform where they can say, you know, down with it all or whatever. And then other people who have been castrated for what they've said hear these people and they go, oh yeah, that's a good idea, right? And I am so against that. That's why we need to have these conversations, and we need to be able to get it wrong. Sorry, go
problem about some of the cancel, and I disagree with most of it, but I cringe when I hear people making very outspoken statements. Like there was one recently where a top British television scriptwriter, who I've actually got loads and loads of time for, but he said only gay people should play gay characters. And I kind of cringe. Well, I disagree with them for a start. I thought, what's acting? Because they have the authenticity. Point, yeah. But I also thought, oh, you're just giving them ammunition. You know, you're just making the rednecks think their worst expectations of what you'll say. You're just playing into that, and so they're going to react in a more extreme way. I just think you have to tread very carefully and be reasonable. I think that just be balanced and be reasonable.
I agree. I work as a clinical counselor, and in the school I was at, grade 7 class, they're talking about rainbow sidewalks, and which is to, you know, support and raise awareness for the LGBTQ community. And the one kid was like, well, that's not fair. And the teacher's like, well, what do you mean? Well, then I can't use that sidewalk. Because the kid thought that because it's a rainbow sidewalk, it's for people of that community, right? So therein lies the balance, is we have to have these conversations so we can get some clarity, right? And I think that a lot of people are kind of scratching their heads, and they're like, well, if I say that, I could offend somebody. Why are we so sensitive? Right? It's okay to, you know, like, it's okay to disagree, but let's just try and understand one another. Now, when I was listening to your episode, I thought it was so amazing. You were talking about Amazon. Did you actually get an Amazon package during that episode?
Yeah, I think I did. I think
that was because you guys were talking about culture and markets changing and stuff. And then you're like, oh, I got to go get my Amazon package. And I was like,
that's
how,
right,
like, that is just human irony in the highest sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, God knows. I mean, we all have our sort of reasons to be critical of Amazon and things. But I sit at my computer and I think I could even order from another website. But I've got Amazon Prime, and my lazy instincts kick in, and, you know, like everybody else, oh God, I'll just order it from Amazon, you know, that was it, you know, and then it appears as by magic the next morning. So yeah,
I have got an Amazon related story, and it kind of ties in with what we were talking about before. is that I went to like a comedy club. It was sort of spoken word comedy club, and the compare. There just seemed to be this. One of the poets got up and said, "Okay, what are the crowd like? Are they all left wing?" And goes, "Yeah, no problem here." I thought, well, that's just an assumption. What if I wasn't? And actually, some of the things being, I won't say talked about, being spoken about, but also poetry being. I thought, no, I don't agree with that. I don't think Jeremy Corbyn's a great leader of the Labour Party and things like that. But I felt like I couldn't say that. But one thing was that the compare was having a bit of sort of pre-act banter, and he was saying, "Oh, what? Any recommendations on Netflix? Blah blah blah." And one guy recommended a show. He says, "Well, actually, the trouble is I always get confused what's on Netflix and what's on Amazon." And the compare said, "You mean you've subscribed to Amazon? Well, you can get it right out of the room. Money to Amazon." I thought, well, I'll keep quiet with my recommendations.
You're supporting this capitalist regime. Yeah. Well, here's the thing too that I think is, and you guys were talking about this, is we're becoming. So I've had I'm doing these Zoom calls and I'm speaking to people all over the world, yourselves. I've spoken to people from, Nigeria, Kenya, New Zealand, and I'm finding something very interesting. I have more in common with the people that I'm talking with than some of my own countrymen, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. So,
and that's this weird, we're finding our minute, very specific culture, and we're kind of going that way. And really politics, it's hard to grasp that, because I look at the left and I look at the right and I just see assholes. You know what I mean? I just see politicians playing political games, playing the populist thing or playing the fear card or whatever. And it's just like, none of what you're saying is resonating with me anymore. And that is actually kind of scary.
Yeah, absolutely.
I feel very alienated from people. I was saying to a friend the other day, I don't feel got a lot in common with most people in my country anymore. And it started with Brexit, and it was exacerbated by COVID and the sort of blasé attitude a lot of people had towards COVID. I thought, I feel alienated. I don't feel like I'm part of the culture, really. I thought I was, but it feels like the last 5 years has proved something else was going on that I just wasn't aware of. And yeah, I often do, with tourists, I take one. Yeah.
Do you think we all as sort of, hesitate to, forgive me for a moment, but as educated metropolitan liberals, you know what I mean? We might be in our own little bubble.
Yeah.
We don't wander out enough, in there, which is, what we've been trying to do with our podcast a bit is trying to get, but it tends to be a bit self-selecting, because you get who are very well educated, who achieve things, or in the arts or things like that. And we all sit around and agree with each other a lot of the time. And so it'd be interesting to get some of the guys down from, work as drivers for Jeremy's firm. And
I think there's a flip side to the metropolitan elite. And that is, if I look at my own story, I came from quite a small town, which was just horrible to grow up in. And I didn't like it there. So you go to university or you go to college and then you move to a big city and you fit in better and you don't want to go back. And it's because, okay, you think I look down on you guys or where I came from, but you were nasty to me. It sounds really whingy. Yeah. But I think that's one very small instance. I remember reading an interview with Paul Schrader, the scriptwriter, and he said he went back to his small town, and the guy, one of his uncles, was criticizing like television. He said, "Oh, these fucking assholes," I know the guy who made this show. He grew up around here, and it was never liked. And so then they go to the big city and they make these TV shows, and then they beam these TV shows into our living rooms and they try and tell us how to live our lives. Well, the fact was they never fit in around here, so they had to go to New York. And I think there's a lot of that, So anybody who's got something about them will leave these little towns and go, and it sounds snobbish, but there's a reality there.
Everybody has pretense, right? And it's like the realest people in the world are some of the roughest. But that's who they are, like honesty is something that I'm getting back to, like just being honest. Like my wife today was like, "Hey, do you want to go see these people?" And I'm like, "No, I don't. And it felt fucking great. I was like, man, I feel so happy I said that, right?
Yeah.
Because we sit in these rooms and people are kind of just wearing masks. But Plato talked about the allegory of the cave, right? And how this guy was in the cave and he was seeing these images, and then finally one day he's like, that's it, I'm getting out of the cave. I'm done with this. But I sometimes think that we get out of our caves and we have these revelations, but really we've just gone into another cave.
Yeah. I'm sure that's true in a sense. And you can get, I'm always very conscious because I come from a very small town, post-industrial, working class place. Right. And my mum died last June, and I was going back and seeing people being up there because I live in the south of England. All the family do. My sister does, and so we were going back up there, and then you suddenly meet all these people you grew up with again. You know, who I have a great relationship in lots of ways with. You know, I've known them all my life, but there were always two sorts of people: the people that left when they were 17 or 18, and the people who stayed behind. And in a sense, it's so local, and the way they think and the way they talk, and the only way to deal with it is that you just, you know, you have to slot back into that world, and you never ever talk about what you do or what your world is like or what, you know, and they say, oh yeah, I was meeting with Jeremy or do the podcast with, you know, but no one there does a podcast. Do you know what I mean? Right. Oh, Jeremy's an actor and a tour guide and does all these sort of, and a writer, and no one up there is an actor or a writer. You know what I mean? It just it doesn't sort of.
I had that experience. I was going out for a drink with some old school friends, and I had a good time. We had a drink, went to watch a football match, but they said, well, what do you do now? And I didn't say I'm an actor. I didn't say I just said one of my act, which is I do children's parties, which is one thing I do.
Right.
They found that quite amusing, actually. They said, oh, really? You were always quite clever when you were at school.
Yeah. That's right. This is what I want to do.
Oh, okay. Well, what's wrong with doing children's play? But I thought, well, I ain't going to bloody say I'm an act. Because for one thing, people always say, oh, have I seen you in anything? And no, you won't have.
Yes.
Yeah. What have you been on telly? And I've only ever done theatre. So I just don't want to go down that road. But also, I think, I don't want to sound like a...
Yeah.
It's like a knob. I don't want to sound like a... I don't want to sound... you know, big-headed or just like an idiot.
Yeah.
Really, which is strange, really. But I'm,
You know how I can tell?
I don't like actors when I see them on TV either. I'll just say that now. I don't really like... I saw Olivia Colman. There was it came up on my Facebook feed this morning, and it was people in Yemen suffering. I thought, I'm really down with it. I'm really... loads of compassion. But then the person doing the appeal was her. I thought, oh, for fuck's sake. I thought, why is it always an actor who has to get involved?
Right. Yeah. Isn't it funny how we have to use actors to convey, you know, political messages or whatever, right? It's like, you're Thor. You played a guy who shot lightning bolts. Like, you're not exactly the person to speak on politics. Right?
Have you ever heard of a guy called Howard Smith?
No.
He was a DJ in New York in the late 60s.
Oh, that's right. It's one of the right wing shock jocks, wasn't he?
Howard Stern.
Not Howard Stern. No, this is a totally different guy. This is somebody. He was good friends with John Lennon and Yoko Ono.
Okay.
Anyway, he did. You can find. I've downloaded about 6 compilations of his show from iTunes. But in one episode, there's about an hour and a half interview with Dustin Hoffman, which is fat, and he's only made 2 movies, I think, The Graduate and Midnight Cowboy. And they had this conversation about actors going on chat shows and talking about politics and talking about, you know, social issues. And he says, well, I'm always skeptical about this. And the host, Howard Smith, said, why are you skeptical? He said, because in my experience, he said, for instance, my own situation, I've just broken through as an actor. I spent the preceding 10 years trying to get work, and that occupied all my time trying to get work as an actor. And now I spend all my time making movies. I don't have time to study the political situation or the Nixon administration or Vietnam or anything. You know, it's all about trying to make it, and then, you know, 24/7 making movies, doing... And so he says, I'm not saying they're wrong, but I'm suspicious. I thought, and he said he went out with a ballet dancer, and her whole world, because obviously ballet dancers, it's nine to 5, you know, going through their exercises, whatever, jetés and leg stretches, flexes, and then they do a show in the evenings. And he said, so he spent some time hanging out with these dancers, and he said they were the most ignorant people. They didn't know what was going on in the news because they were just in that little bubble, the theatre world bubble.
Yeah.
And I think there's something in that, you know, why you now get, and I can't help thinking there's a bit of self-promotion and a bit of self-aggrandizement going on with it in many cases, not all of them.
I think that's such a great point. It's like, you know, what you're doing, what you're focusing on, that's what you're doing and what you're focusing on. Meanwhile, you know, there's all kinds of stuff going around us. Like my uncle, he'll ask me about something like, oh man, did you hear about what happened? And it's like, you know, on the news or whatever. And I don't watch news because, you know, I feel like there's a bit of an agenda with news. I'm not a conspiracy theorist or anything, but, and he's like, how do you not know about what's going on in Pakistan and over there? It's like, well, I don't know. Am I supposed to know? If I'm supposed to know, you're going to tell me, right? So the other thing too, is that I think with celebrity, I guess what I'm trying to say is we're animals, right? We really are animals, and we think we're so smart. But at the end of the day, you know, we're supposed to be grabbing low-hanging fruit off trees and being like, yeah, right? That's kind of what we do. But with celebrity, imagine anywhere you go in the world and people could recognize you, how discomforting that would be.
It's weird.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
It's weird.
That's horrifying. Like,
and you can never come back from that. You've crossed the line.
Never. Right? Like you could be Shia LaBeouf and you have no money or whatever. I think he was broke at one point, but people always be like, hey, you're the Transformer guy. And it's like, can you please leave me alone? My life is in complete shambles, right? Like, you know, there's no escape. And I think that just is like hell on our minds. One thing that you're talking about in your episode that I loved was this sort of how society sort of separates itself. And you talked about gender, and then I think it was Jeremy, you're talking about introverts and extroverts.
Oh yes.
And how this
what do you want to know about that?
Well, it's funny you bring that up, is because you're talking about how in society there's introverts and there's extroverts, and you know, introverts get things done and extroverts say they're going to get things done. You know, they're these personalities, right?
It's kind of like that. I think with extroverts, they push themselves to the front, but they're not necessarily the best people to take charge, because I think introverts by their very nature are more thoughtful and will give something more consideration. But I think society is biased in favor of the extrovert. I think that's part of the problem. I also, have you heard of a guy called John Ronson?
No.
He's I don't know how to say. He's kind of like a journalist, but he goes around. He takes a theme and he runs with it. He had a book out called "So You've Been Publicly Shamed," and he'll interview people who've been publicly shamed and how they, you know, on the internet or whatever. And he invented something else called the psychopath test, which is how psychopaths aren't necessarily serial killers. They can be CEOs, and there's a test you can determine very early on in life to determine, you know, whether you are in the 2% of the population who are psychopaths. And there are some professions like being in the military, or even being, you know, the head of Amazon, where it may be advantageous to be a psychopath or a sociopath. Anyway, John Ronson was talking about, I mean, he talks about being an introvert quite a lot, but he also talked about this idea of brainstorming and how it's been shown not to be a very effective way of generating ideas, because usually it's the people who shout loudest who get heard. And introverts or reflective people tend to want to go off and give it some consideration. So the best thing you do is hire two great people, two creative people to go off, say, think about this overnight, come back with some ideas. But no, there's this pressure, and the loudest people, the most extrovert people, the show-offs, if you like, tend to push to the forefront and say things without much, through sheer force of personality. They get their things on the whiteboard. And he was saying it's a bit of a flawed system. But I then, a couple of weeks after that, I was in a brainstorming session, and I thought, yeah, he was right. He was right, because it's he who shouts or she who shouts loudest that's getting heard here. And it also becomes, we're thinking about an idea for a play, and it became writing by committee. And so there was no authorial voice. And so that was a problem in itself. But I do think that some facility ought to be put in place within organizations and companies and institutions that recognizes introverts often have, will go and invent the internet or something, but they need a bit of time and space, and they're generally better off working on their own,
Well, now to sort of piggyback off that, you guys probably think like, oh, this guy, Rob, he's such an extrovert, right? Like, cause I'm loud and gregarious or whatever. But as I've gotten older, I'm actually much more reflective. Like this takes energy out of me. And then afterwards I'm like, hence I was telling you before about how my wife was like, let's go see these people. And I'm like, no, I don't want to go see those people, because I actually am an introvert, but I have this weird extroverted shell that makes it good to sell things or whatever, because that's what we're always doing.
I think I'm the same. And I heard Joni Mitchell in an interview once, and they were saying, well, you can write these deep, personal, reflective songs, and you can go out and sing in front of thousands of people. She says, yeah, I think I'm a bitrovert.
Yes. Yeah. I like that.
I also, have you seen a show called, what's it called? Pose, about the voguing scene in New York in the early 90s. And there's a character in that who's the end, voguing, like Madonna made popular in that video, where they dress up and they pretend they're on the catwalk and they strut around to music, and it's all elaborate fancy dress, and it's all very flamboyant and camp, and it's brilliant actually. And the MC is one of the most outrageous characters as it is. But I saw one of these actors around the table things on YouTube, where actors are talking about their career, and the host said, what's the most surprising thing about yourself, or the thing that people would be most surprised to find out? And he said, I'm a situational extrovert. And they said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, I'm an extrovert when I need to be. People think I'm like this all the time, but I just have the capacity to turn it on.
Right.
And I think I'm a bit like that. I'm not to his extent, but I have the tools and the capacity to go on stage and perform, or to conduct an interview, or to get up and sing a song. But actually, when it comes to my own personal taste, I'm happy in my own company, and I'm happy doing quiet things.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think that's one of the things that's come out of COVID, because I've discovered, because I'm very gregarious and I love people, but there are times recently when I've just felt, to go home and be back in my own place. And I saw my girlfriend yesterday, and then I dropped her back off home this morning. I thought, it's actually quite nice. Now, talk to you guys later. I can do what I want. I've got my list of things I want to do, and I'm, much more content than I ever thought I would be. So I'm discovering a bit of introspection quite late in life. It's a really, it has been something that probably none of us would have had the opportunity to discover, really, in some ways, apart from the current situation.
But I think for many years I felt shame about being an introvert, and I wouldn't admit I was an introvert because I thought it was a shameful thing to be, and that's because I was conflating it with shyness, which in itself isn't a bad thing, Right. But when I think when I was young, I had a crippling shyness, and I think people almost shamed me for that. By you need to stand up for yourself, or you need to be more assertive, need to put yourself to the front. And when I got to drama school, I went to drama school, and it was full of extroverts, and they used to say, "Oh, you're a really quiet guy. You're really quietly spoken," or all this, and I felt it was a source of shame when it was just my personality. And as I got more, I wouldn't say I'm shy now. I think I've built up confidence over the years, but I think I have an introspective side,
right?
And but I confuse shyness with introspection. And I think introspection is, I just prefer it this way, I'm not afraid of going over and speaking to that guy at the bar, but I prefer to sit here and read a book.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Rob. Go, you Rob.
No, Graham. I
was just going to say, Jeremy did a one-man show about sex addiction, and if you'd seen him do that for an hour, you would not think he was.
Yeah. Because that's vulnerable, right?
Yeah,
it is vulnerable, but you know what it is. I always think I've got a couple of really good examples. I remember Johnny Carson interviewing Richard Pryor, and they both admit they were very shy. This is on the Tonight Show. They both admitted they were very shy, introspective guys, and they both confessed that when they went to a party, they used to hide in the bathroom, and they did some sort of gag about amazing what you can find in people's medicine cabinets. And then Richard Pryor said, well, why do you think it is? Why do you think we do what? You're on this talk show. I'm a comedian. Why? And he said, you know what it is? I think because somebody said, here's a stage, here's a platform. Somebody's given us license. It's when you're not given the platform and you have to sort of edge your own way and you're on an equal plateau. And also, I think with acting, you're pretending to be somebody else. You're not
the psychological contract. Yeah, right. Yeah.
You're pretending to be somebody else, so you're not being you. I think being a comedian, the type of comedian where you are being you, where you are exhibiting your own personality, must be one of the most terrifying things, and having to deal with hecklers and all that.
Well, and you mentioned comedians. They're geniuses. They're, hundreds of years from now, how we look at Socrates and Aristotle? I imagine that's how people will look at Jerry Seinfeld.
Yeah, very likely.
Right? Yeah. Like just as this guy who was able to characterize and sort of satirize the civilization at the time, right? Yeah. And that's why I think truly successful people who are in the spotlight often they're introverts that are able to sort of turn that switch, whereas just extroverts. I wonder if there's a correlation between, mental illness and introversion and extroversion, right? Like when I'm just sitting at home and I'm being pensive, I'm not being depressed. I'm being thoughtful, but somebody might be like, oh man, he's so solemn and sulky. So I don't know. I wonder about mental wellness.
Yeah, I mean, this is mental illness. Yeah. And I think this is such a difficult thing, isn't it? Because, to be honest, and to be perhaps a bit controversial about this, I often wonder where mental illness starts, self-indulgence finishes, you know what I mean? And there are people who are genuinely suffering and mentally ill.
Oh, yes, yeah.
People who kind of wave that flag and you think, no, you're just a self-indulgent. Okay, you know what I mean? To find more, who ought to be a bit more, who ought to look at themselves in the mirror a bit more clearly. Perhaps that's the wrong way to look at it.
No. I think too that there's a lot of messages. Like when we go on the internet, and honestly, man, to me, the internet is like, it's the new gold rush. Everybody's a prospector. They're all trying to find their gold nugget and I'm a millionaire, right? And then we see these things and a lot of what's on there is so clearly inauthentic, right? Yeah. These influencers and stuff. But I think that this life that some people live of, oh, look how posh my life is. We do that whole comparative thing. And then we always come up lacking. Anytime we're comparing ourselves with somebody else, oftentimes we come up lacking. And so much of that is what I have done in my own society. Right. So I'm kind of speaking for myself, but
yeah, no, absolutely. It's who knows? I mean, people seem to be predicting a tsunami of mental illness when COVID comes. But I think if it, like we were just discussing, if it's given us a chance to be a bit more introspective and maybe decide what was really important to us, then there might be. And if it's a shot across the bows, say, look, you guys aren't, we're human beings with X billion of us on the planet, but we can't control most stuff. We can't control. If a plague like this can happen, but maybe we can, we're on our way to screwing up the environment. Then maybe it's time for a little, back and think a bit more clearly about what we really do want and what's important. But or maybe that's just me being pretentious. But I kind of hope that's the case. Yeah, I really do.
Perhaps the discomfort is a message that, we can either run from and distract ourselves from, or we can turn and face, and a lot of the people that I've spoken to on here, again, perhaps it is an echo chamber, but there is that similar sort of, what can I do to better my situation? Now, Jeremy, you'd also mentioned and you don't have to speak to this if you're not comfortable with it, but you talked about OCD.
Yeah.
And how that's been during COVID.
Yeah, it hasn't been great.
Yes.
So I've had obsessive compulsive disorder for about 30 years, although I'm a lot better than I used to be. I've had 2 rounds of treatment, hospital treatment and group therapy, CBT. It mainly takes the form of contamination fears. Historically, that's been around fears of HIV contamination and asbestos poisoning. Also checking doorknobs, or locked doors, electrical appliances, ovens, thinking I can smell smoke and going back to check. But also magical thinking, which is a whole other world area where I think I can cause something to happen by doing or not doing certain action. It's one of the things I probably find most difficult because it's the most insane to sounding, but it is, there's no cause and effect, but somehow, if I do something, it will cause somebody to die or the world to end or something.
Right.
But, I've been getting better and better over the years. I run an OCD support group. It's a peer-led support group in Oxford. That's another one of our podcasts, Oxford Lives, with Stephen Hoskins, which is a good one. I also work for the charity OCD Action. Really enjoyed that. Actually ran a pub quiz for them, a virtual pub quiz for them last night. But in terms of the pandemic, it's been really difficult, and because I do have contamination fears and I am hypervigilant around these things, and it basically feels that everything your therapist has been telling you not to do over the years, the government is now telling you to do, and the doctors are telling you to do, like wash your hands thoroughly, I've been trying for years not to wash my hands thoroughly, and it's difficult because you feel like your OCD has now been given license. And I'm not the only person, because I'm very much plugged into the community, the OCD community. I run quite a few online support groups, and it's a continuing theme that everything you've been taught to do in order to combat your OCD, particularly with contamination fears, you're now being encouraged to do. When I walk past a bus shelter and there's a poster saying, "Imagine that you've got COVID."
Yeah.
I don't need that kind of
Holy shit, I'm thinking about that all the time. Yeah.
That's already on my mind, what if I've got COVID, So I don't need encouragement, but probably most people do. Most people need to be hammered, most people need to be spoon-fed and hammered over the head. But for me personally, I don't need any encouragement in that area. And when somebody says wash your hands for 30 seconds, I'll be washing my hands for 3 minutes. Or when somebody says, Boris Johnson famously said, wash your hands for 2 happy birthdays. But he meant sing happy birthday twice and you'll have washed your hands.
Right.
I'll do about 20 happy birthdays.
Yeah.
But I'm just I find it difficult. And I find it, when I did go back to work for 4 months tour guiding, and I was only outside, so that was great. But I was shocked at a lot of people's what I saw as negligence. And part of it, I do genuinely feel is justified. When people go into a shop and they're not wearing a mask, I think, what the hell are you doing? And when the staff aren't wearing, our local supermarket, I went in there twice recently, and the security guard had his mask around his chin. I thought, well, if you're not wearing your mask properly, what chance of the rest of us? Yeah. There's also this feeling of being over responsible. So it's not just about, it's partly about my own health because I'm asthmatic. I don't want to end up on a ventilator, but it's also the fear that I will contract COVID through my own negligence and irresponsibility. I will then pass it on to somebody else, and I'll have caused a serious illness or a death. So it's about me being responsible. So it's almost like feeling guilty in advance of possibly doing something. I've lost my thread now, but yeah, so it's 2-track. It's the actual health consequence. It's also about fear of, and it's also this thing about, I need to go and confront that person because they're not wearing a mask, which I have done only about 5 times. Yeah. Because we're all cowards,
right?
And it usually falls on deaf ears. But I feel I'm not being a responsible citizen unless I go and confront that or report that. When I did go for one COVID test, and the guy on the desk wasn't wearing a mask. Sounds ridiculous. So I did ring up and complain the next day.
Yeah.
And I know that's a responsible thing to do, but I also know most people wouldn't do that. And I know part of that is me being a control. It's me being moral, but it's me being a control freak. And on some level, it's a fear of me being punished for not doing the right thing. And I'm pretty sure that the flat, you say apartment in Canada, don't you? The apartment downstairs was having a small party last night, which is from the voices that were coming through the floorboards, the spirited caterwauling. I'm pretty sure they're having some kind of party.
Right.
And I thought, do I ring the police? I have done that kind of thing in the past. And I thought, no, I'm going to let it go. There's only so much I can do. I'm not the world's policeman. But it's something I wrestle with, feelings of over-responsibility.
Yeah. So what has helped you to sort of, because you raise a very good point, Jeremy. This is like, if you didn't have OCD before, you might have symptoms of it right now because of, again, all these messages that we're getting. So you're in a heightened state of your OCD you're sort of describing. Is that correct?
Well, we are now worried about a new generation of people developing OCD because of this pandemic. And interestingly enough, in the early days of the first lockdown, I did quite a few interviews for like Channel 4 News and BBC because they latched onto this. Like, what if you've got OCD? What if you already got contamination? Or what if you just have a disposition or a propensity towards that and it hasn't been fully realised yet? Is it going to act like a catalyst in the same way that the HIV fear in the 80s, which is what happened to me? You have these very ominous government adverts with, lightning and big monolith and these predictions. Every family in the country would be affected by the year 2000, and I was just hitting puberty at the time, and there were all these things like, you can get it from kissing somebody, or you can get it from shaking somebody's hand, because nobody really knew.
Yes.
So that was one of the first OCD things I ever latched onto, and I think the same's probably going to happen now with a new generation with COVID.
Especially children, right? Like, kids are getting these messages, and again, I work with children, right? And so you kind of see like, there's some fears around like, all you got to do is just wash your hands. Cause when I was younger, I washed my hands so much that my knuckles bled because I had perhaps, looking back in reflection, I would say that I did have some OCD tendencies, which maybe is why I'm able to hyper focus on some of the things that I do and just not hyper focus on some of the other things. But anyways, talk to my wife about that. But the other thing is what has helped you sort of to combat this? Like
Well, I think what has helped me is support groups and speaking to like-minded people. We did have one, we had a session with a guy called Dr. Paul Salkowskis, who's one of the leading OCD clinicians. He's now based in Oxford. But we had an online session with him about COVID, and his advice was do what the government's telling you, do what the medical practitioners tell you, but do no more. And it sounds really obvious.
Right.
But he also said, I'm not expecting miracles in this pandemic. But the main thing is, don't let it get worse. Just 3 words he said. He said, hold the line. Just at least don't backtrack. Don't let your OCD get worse. Just hold the line. And that was a really useful phase that I've actually, my girlfriend did this for me. She wrote it on a piece of card, which I have next to my computer.
Yeah.
Hold the line.
Yeah.
And whenever my brain starts to spiral, I just look at that. Yeah, hold the line. Just, okay, not expecting perfection here. Just don't let it go any further, But it's easier said than done. I have good days and bad days. Generally, in recent years, my OCD has been a lot better. But as I say, this pandemic has brought certain things up to the fore again.
What a setback. But again, the importance of, holding the line. What has really helped me is, because I live with a child that essentially dictates my life. So when my kid goes to bed, I try to make time to sort of meditate, because I'm on my phone all the time. And like I was saying to Graham, I feel like my brain is hurting sometimes because of the screen time I'm getting. So I try to make half an hour. And, and when I say this, I try to do it daily. Yeah, okay, I'm doing it once a week. But anyways, when I do it, right, it is really helpful. And that's half an hour of just silence. And I just try to focus on my breathing. And I actually find afterwards that, it's almost like my ideas are coming together. So that has really helped me. Now, last question, because I can't believe it, we're about to run out of time again. So social drinking in Oxford and Britain in general, is it similar to because Graeme, you've actually been to Western Canada. Is it similar to social drinking here? So let me just explain. Right now I'm doing dry February. And yeah, I know, shame on me, right? And it's the shortest month of the year. Of course I'm doing it during February. But I have found I have found that it's been quite helpful because I love beer. I love beer. And in my podcast, I talk about how in my 20s, I was the world's greatest partier. But now I've subdued it. So when I was in my 20s, social drinking was me acting like a idiot. Whereas what I'm picking up in Oxford, the culture around sort of social drinking is you guys go to a pub to meet with your friends and you're sitting down and you're kind of talking sort of thing. It's a little bit slower paced.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a big difference. There's an age difference as well. I mean, there's middle-aged men, you know what I mean? I go out with friends, or Jeremy and I would meet, and we'd have a beer and we'd talk, and it is a very social thing. But I remember when I was a youngster, and I can see it reflected in, you go out and it was all about getting hammered, and it was all, and I think in a way, sort of plus ça change, nothing is different, across the generations, and
just getting rinsed.
Yeah, and you see,
we do have a drink. We have a drink problem in this country. Definitely, we have a drink problem.
Oh, absolutely.
Actually, one of the peak groups of middle-aged men. Middle-aged white men are on the rise. Young people, 25% of young people in this country don't drink now. So maybe it's all going backwards. I remember hearing this radio phone once about problem drinking, and the presenter was saying, "Do we have a drink problem in this country?" He said, "We have a work problem," and what they meant was we work the longest hours in Europe. And so the whole of our focus is on getting to the weekend, and this big pressure valve release. Everybody goes out on a Friday night and goes crazy.
Yeah.
So we don't drink in a measured way like they do in parts of the continent. Like we don't have a glass of wine with a meal. We drink. A lot of people drink to excess.
I'm going to say mea culpa because I was talking to some of the old guys I used to work with. One of the guys said, "Oh God, I'm sort of drinking too much, basically, because it comes to 7 o'clock at night, and I'm thinking I'm going to make some dinner for us all, and then next thing you know, you've had 2 beers out of the fridge, and a bottle of wine has just evaporated during the evening. And what happened there? And then you think, yeah, absolutely, yeah, and I sort of buy my wine on this subscription service that where you can buy, and it appears again like Amazon. It's wonderful. Appears by magic, a big case of wine appears on the doorstep. And I went right into my sort of back kitchen the other day, and someone had broken in the night and drunk all. And what happened there? And it's too easy to say, "Oh, I'm just finished work for the day, whatever. I'm going to sit with a glass." And yeah, definitely.
It is still very much part of the social fabric, though, in Britain, meeting up at the pub and going for a drink. I think Oxford, again, is quite exceptional. It's a fairly civilized place, and the pubs can be quite sedate and cozy, roaring fires and timber beams and books on the wall. But if you go to most towns around Britain on a Saturday night, if you go to the high street, it's often pandemonium, and people falling over, people having fights, police transit vans running, particularly among, well, it has, as I say, it has been young people. That seems to be turning now, but yeah, we have a drinking. I think it's a very North European thing as well, and I think it's something to do with being in a cold climate. I mean, it almost feels, well, it's constant. I mean, look at Ireland. That island's very similar. Big drinking. Ireland and Scotland, huge drinking cultures. Grey skies and barren landscape.
Well, it's kind of like
you
if
feel
I
justified in having a Guinness and a whiskey chaser.
well, it's like if I show you what my backyard looks like, it's like, you know, it's wet and dank, and it's like, well, what else is there to do? Might as well have a bunch of scotch.
There's that allure, you know, the alcohol bubble.
Well, I've got to tell you my Vancouver story, actually.
Oh, yes, please do.
We went down to one of the local brewery pubs. I can't remember what it was called. Well, I don't know whether I ever wrote it down anywhere. And it was brilliant. It was the first time in my life I'd ever had beers. You know, where they give you a little taste.
Yeah, the flights. Yeah.
I don't know whether you have had that, Jeremy, where they you know, if you go to a brewery, then they give you fantastic. Yeah.
You guys come here, and I will show you good beer. Canadians have amazing beer. Don't drink Canadian. That's bullshit. That's bullshit. No, you drink IPAs, and yesterday
I love a pale ale.
Oh,
that's my typical pale ale.
If you are a beer drinker, this is your mecca.
Yeah, it was fantastic. But I hurt myself quite badly because when I was talking to the guy who was waiting on us, and I said, "Oh, that is lovely, and I'll have a pint of that." It turned out to be 8%, whereas about the most you're going to get is 5%. So I was feeling very sorry for myself the next morning. You know, you know, it was on a bit of self-indulgence, but I was misled by thinking it was all going to be sort of 4 or 5%, but it wasn't. It was very much stronger. You know,
Some of the beers here, you need a fork and a knife. So, guys, thank you so much for being on here. Man, I've had a blast. Time has it's escaped me, so thank you so much for being on. Stay healthy, stay safe.
Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Good. Awesome. So we'll listen to the rest of your interviews, Rob, and see around the world. And I think it's a great idea, actually. And more power to your elbow. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, guys. Okay, we'll keep in touch.
Okay, take care.